Okay, good morning, everybody. It's just after 10 o'clock on Wednesday. Welcome to today's event, which is focused on the case for full employment and its role in tackling the regional differences that we see across the country. I was going to say levelling up, but I don't know if we still have a levelling up policy agenda, or at least the government, whether the government has a levelling up policy agenda, but I'm sure our guest speaker will have some thoughts on that. As you can see, the format is a little bit unusual, a little bit different from our usual format. In a moment, our very special guest, Alison McGovern, who is the MP for Wirral South and a Shadow Minister for Employment, is going to set out her thoughts and reflections on this issue about the need for full employment, why it's so critically important for the future prosperity of the country. Alison's going to speak to us for 15 or 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation, she and I, and then we have an esteemed panel that's going to give some reflections on what Alison has said and broaden it out into issues more generally. And I'll introduce the panel at that appropriate time. As always, just a few words of housekeeping, just so you know the event is being recorded and will be made available on our website at a later date. You can ask questions of Alison or indeed our panelists throughout, and you do that in the chat function, in the Q&A function, sorry, the Q&A function, not the chat function, and I'll be picking up questions and putting them to Alison and panelists as appropriate. And the hashtag for the event is Real Full Employment, and we have a very hard finish deadline of 11:14, and that's because Alison needs to get back for PMQs, which promises to be lively and entertaining, even more so than usual, given it's the last PMQs for this particular Prime Minister. So that's the format, that's how we're going to run. But without further ado, Alison, it's fantastic to have you, and we're going to great to listen to what you have to say. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew, and to everyone at Centre for Cities for asking me here this morning to speak on this most important subject of employment and what real full employment could do for our country. I must just say right at the beginning, I mean, firstly, Centre for Cities has been an incredible organisation for some years now. I think that focus on economic geography and the role that cities play in our country has been a crucial one for some years, and I think Centre for Cities has been at the heart of that discussion, and I think that the work they do is absolutely excellent. So it's a real pleasure to speak at Centre for Cities this morning. It also feels like not only the right place to be having this conversation, but it's the right time. We know, as Andrew just said, Boris Johnson will depart number 10 at some point. Unclear exactly when, but by September we should have a new Prime Minister. And whilst the focus in Westminster is on who exactly will replace him, I think the much more important question for the country is, will the Tories now leave levelling up behind? Boris Johnson has often claimed this as his driving mission, and I think that historians will judge whether he managed to do anything to level up a country in his 3 years of office, or whether in fact rising food bank numbers and falling wages told a story of a man much more interested in pantomime and dressing up than he was with the policy seriousness that should have sat behind the words that he used. So as we on the Labour side prepare and ask ourselves the toughest possible questions that will drive our approach to our next manifesto and hopefully the next Labour government, I personally think it's important that our driving principles are clear. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. I think that levelling up, whether or not you like those words, whether you prefer economic rebalancing or whether you prefer tackling inequality as a frame, I think whatever the Tories or Boris Johnson individually meant by levelling up is really a mission that, in my opinion, will only ever be delivered on or action taken on by a Labour government. And that's what I want to talk about this morning, because as Lisa Nandy has said, a levelling up agenda. I hate the word agenda. It's so kind of like ludicrously policy buzzword, but any sort of approach to levelling up that doesn't have jobs at the heart of it is fundamentally non-serious. And I think we would expect Boris Johnson to not have been serious about levelling up, and so it has proved. So that's why I think that we need to accept that whatever is going on in employment at the moment, that what we don't have is full employment that should be delivering what we really want from the jobs market, which is a chance and opportunity for everybody to be paid decently and to have a career where they move on and move up in work. And that's why this morning I want to set out briefly what I consider to be two false prospectuses, two policy cul-de-sacs, areas where we've heard a lot in politics over the past 5 or 6 years, but I think are now shown to be dead ends. And finally, real full employment, that which I think should be one of the driving missions and beliefs that underpins that sense of prosperity, security and respect that Keir Starmer has rightly set out as our ambition for Britain. So I want to say that we ought not to be nostalgic about the economy. We should embrace technology and new innovations as good and a positive force, not a negative force. And as I say, finally set out the case for real full employment. So firstly, on nostalgia. Since the Brexit referendum, I think that there has been a sense of looking back, that somehow we need to recreate what has been lost. But actually, looking back is almost always a false prospectus. I mean, it's a ridiculous thing to do as a politician anyway, because the past, you know, as a matter of simple truth, is not coming back. We will always move forward. But also, nostalgia is a kind of seductive liar, in that always when we look back, we kind of tell ourselves that things were perhaps better than they were. You know, if we think back to perhaps a time when northern towns had a different economic mix, where some of the mills and the warehouses that we see in the geography of northern towns had factories and other things, other kinds of economic inactivity. We think maybe that was a golden era, but actually that's simply not true. The 1950s was much poorer than we ever remember, and the manufacturing sector was never as large as I think it seems in people's imagination. And in fact, there's much more manufacturing in our country now than there ever was in the mid-1950s. And of course, in the post-war era, child mortality was much higher, and life expectancy was a shadow of what it is today. So the idea that somehow there was a golden era in the 50s or the 60s is simply not the case. To take a cause célèbre, you know, fishing, which is of course important in some parts of our country, has never been a massive employer. And in terms of the employment and the kind of jobs and prospects that we want for people, the idea that we can turn the clock back and all will be well is simply not the case. And in fact, you know, we're often guilty on the left of this too. We look back at that government that took over in the post-war era, whilst they did incredible things and they responded to the challenge of child mortality and infectious diseases at the time and created the National Health Service. It's painfully familiar to me that after that great reforming Labour government, we had an incredibly hard winter in 1948, a very difficult time, significant unemployment, and Labour then spent 13 years in opposition between 1951 and 1964. So the idea that we should have levelling up or politics as historical recreation, I think, is a mistake. And in order to embrace the future, I think we also need to look back at some of the recent discussion about how our economy will change and accept that some of the more recent narrative has been wrong too. Because I remember 5-6 years ago being told that the real concern that we should have in the labour market was that we should worry that technology would somehow create jobless growth, that we would end up with robots stealing all of our jobs. I think if you look at the vacancies crisis that we have now in the British economy, I think you can see that that's simply not the case. That actually a growing economy uses technology and innovation to create new and better jobs. Of course, there will be displacement effects. Of course, there will be change that can sometimes be difficult and needs to be mediated by a good government. But technology offers us hope. New innovation can make our economy stronger, not weaker. And I think this is the other policy cul-de-sac. No to nostalgia and no to the idea that somehow technology is a problem. And I think this is particularly insightful when we consider the role of technology and how it can help improve productivity. And I just want to mention three forms of technology here that I think are particularly helpful and have shaped my thinking. Washing machines, abortion pills, and loft insulation. So, washing machines. Sometimes, when I'm having a bit of a hard day, balancing out the work of a Member of Parliament in my constituency, coming to Westminster, dealing with politics there, and also thinking about all the other things that I have to do in my life, I think about the washing machine in my kitchen, and I am grateful. I'm grateful that technology has over time relieved women of domestic duties that meant that we spent our time scrubbing and dealing with laundry rather than putting our skills and talents to a more productive use. And I think sometimes we overlook in this conversation of technology the more basic ways in which simple technologies, widely spread, can open up opportunities at work for people who for structural reasons have been without them for too long. And that is true for no one more than the women in our society. Women joining the labour market has been an incredible force for growth in our country. And I think it's that basic domestic technology that has really made that change. One of the things that we've learned more recently is about how flexible public services that similarly find new and innovative ways, not necessarily always at the high end of technology. It's not, of course, we need incredible robots that can conduct surgery, that can save people's lives in a way that we never thought before in the NHS. But if we look at the use of medical terminations in COVID, but also across the past decade, we've seen this has created much more flexible services for women, much more responsive way in which they can control their own fertility and reproductive rights, and that it's also done in a safer way. And again, I think the thing that I'm struck by is how helping our public services be much more responsive and easier to use has meant that we can empower people to take control of their own lives and have autonomy. My final point is on loft insulation. I think we all know, particularly over the past week, that climate change is having a huge impact on us. We need to do incredible things to change our energy mix, but also our energy use. But I look at the housing around our country where 15% of it was built between the wars, and there really is a geographic context to this, where we know we have cities that have outer estates built between the wars, where the housing is good but leaks energy. That's causing people's bills to be too high, and it's also making their lives less comfortable than they would otherwise be. Use basic technologies like loft insulation to make those houses more energy efficient, warmer in the winter, and cheaper to run. We could actually change the lives of the millions of people that live in that 15% of our housing stock built between wars. And I suppose the lesson I take from these more basic forms of technology and the way that they have spread and had an impact on people's lives, or in the case of loft insulation, the way it could inspire better use of the energy that we have, I ask myself whether for a more productive country, maybe what we need is to obsess not so much on the productivity gains and the work that's done right at the top end, most technologically advanced part of our country, but maybe we need to focus on the majority of people, the work that they're doing and the way that they put their skills and talents to use. And these two thoughts, the idea that we cannot allow nostalgia to dominate our politics or our economic plans, that we need technology and innovation in our economy, but crucially improving everyone's chances at work, not just those at the top end, has made me think that actually the challenge for the next Labour government will be real full employment everywhere. An end to the waste of time and talent that we see far too much in our country, and the opportunity for everybody to put their time to good use and earn a decent living. You know, students of economics will know that that is the purpose, after all, of full employment. Full employment should provide the conditions where everybody can be in the best position to get a decent living for their family. But I would ask anybody to look at the British economy today and ask whether, despite the vacancies crisis, we truly have an economy with full employment. As we saw yesterday in the employment statistics, rather, real wages are still falling, and this is particularly pronounced if you strip out the effect of bonuses. Poverty is rising, and the use of food banks has become such a significant feature in our economy that it's not just a few people with specific conditions or who've got to a crisis point that are now using food banks. It's those people who used to donate to food banks who are now having to go back and get an emergency food parcel themselves. And too many schools and hospitals are providing food bank facilities for people in work that ought to pay them enough, teachers, nurses. So we have this bizarre situation. Geographical disparities are significant. I would say, though, it's not always obvious where the problems are, and despite being a Member of Parliament for Merseyside and knowing that in wealth terms, my constituents are far less likely to build up significant assets than people in London and the South East, actually the truth is that geographical disparities are not what people always think. It's not a North versus South situation. My constituents in Merseyside often have the opportunity to have better amenity in green space or in working flexibility than those who work in the capital. And we know that London itself faces very high unemployment, similar to the Northeast, in fact, which I think is a feature of our economy most people wouldn't be aware of. So we know that as productivity drives wage growth, we need to focus on those areas where we've struggled for too long with low and stagnant productivity and work out how to improve our labour market and give better chances for everybody. So just let me conclude by saying briefly what I think real full employment everywhere would look like. So firstly, on this question of economic geography that I think has been really that's what made the political salience of levelling up. I think we have to be honest and say simple binaries are false. It is not a north-south divide. It's not towns versus cities. There are examples of successful towns in the north and towns with significant levels of poverty in the south. The truth is, every place needs a plan, because in our economy now, context is everything. We know that the different mix of sectors and population in different areas will help them drive forward and tackle poverty, inequality, and get greater use of people's time and talents in their area. And that will take, for every place, a plan. And colleagues will know that Keir Starmer has asked Gordon Brown to consider how we can progress devolution. And I'm confident that economic policy will be a very strong part of that, which I'll say more about in a moment. I do just want to talk about, briefly, gender, disability and race, because as I mentioned earlier, women joining the labour market has been an incredible force in our economy. But we know that the biggest problem in using women's time and talents well is the cost of childcare. It's a fundamental problem that childcare costs have increased by around 44% since 2010. As my colleague Bridget Phillipson often points to, it's at the heart of the cost of living crisis. And a TUC poll found that 1 in 3 parents spend about a third of their income on childcare. And we have the highest childcare costs of a proportion of household income in the OECD, which means that women are much more likely to remain economically inactive and still at this point excluded from the labour market. Of course, there's issues as well with intersectionality, so where race and gender combine for people, creating problems for those of a diverse background who are much more likely to be in work that's less well paid, and where support for social infrastructure like childcare could help them progress. You know, when I think about real full employment, often the point that I come to most quickly is disability. We know that people with disabilities are far less likely to be in work. Unemployment is twice as high for people with disabilities, and they're 3 times more likely to be economically inactive. At the moment, if you put in an access to work application through the DWP to get support as a disabled person to stay in work, it takes about 12 weeks to agree it. I can't imagine signing a contract with a new employer, wanting to crack on, wanting to get in there and blaze a trail, and having to wait 12 weeks for the Department for Work and Pensions to decide whether I as a disabled person could have my rights met to be economically active like everybody else. And of course, we know that race is a driving force in the economic chances of our people. And whatever levelling up means, it must mean equality in chance and opportunity, so that Black people, Bangladeshis, Pakistani people have all of the chances and opportunity of everyone. And I think that this lack of equality in our labour market really is a sign of malfunctioning, that lost potential. So finally, I just want to say a couple of words on the how. Now, I should say we're at the beginning of a conversation about this. Jonathan Ashworth and I have been talking to many stakeholders and experts on this. We've come to some early conclusions, and I would love people's thoughts on where we should progress this. I just want to give an indication of the direction of travel. So firstly, in relation to the Department for Work and Pensions itself, you know, if every place needs a plan, then every place needs the policy levers to pull to make that plan work. At the moment, Whitehall decides what your employment support services look like. So if you want to help people get good jobs, and from good jobs get better jobs, those decisions are taken by a very small number of people who work in SW1. I mean, you know, possibly they work from home these days, well, that would be great, but they're still essentially taking policy choices under a very small number of people. And this creates what the economist Philip McCann describes as a very narrow funnel. So there's a huge amount of experience and knowledge about the functioning of our economy that simply cannot get through that tight funnel that is policy making in Whitehall. So we need to localise the work of job centres, and I've spoken to my colleagues Steve Rotherham, Andy Burnham, Tracy Braben and others, council leaders, and really good, experienced local leaders who see that they could do more if they had more policy levers to pull. Across government as well, it's not just what DWP does, but across government we need to deal with barriers to increasing productivity. Now, I've mentioned Bridget's work on childcare, but there's other things too. The government's own report into pay progression found that public transport, specifically buses, could do a huge amount to improve the job choice that people have. If you're living in Oldham and you're on low pay, and having a greater job choice where you could get paid more depends on being able to get to the city centre at the right time after you've dropped your child off from school. The really poor public transport services in certain parts of our cities and towns is really holding us back. And my final point is that I strongly believe that at the UK level, we really need to rethink levelling up away from projects and initiatives and much more towards institutional reform that's likely to generate better productivity, better job quality, and better wage potential. I'm not sure how many people have really read the Levelling Up white paper. I'm guessing that everyone on this Zoom has read the Levelling Up white paper in full. It's quite long. And actually, I read much of the first half of it and thought that the analysis was excellent. I thought that the quality of the analysis was good. And I was waiting for that bit that was about the how. And what I found was a list of the government's existing schemes that councils can bid for, the Towns Fund, the Shared Prosperity Fund. These are competitive processes that councils bid in for that local authorities tell me makes their life more difficult as they pit one town or one city against another. So I think we need to move away from this initiative-itis, pockets of money that, at its best, demonstrates government that doesn't really understand how its own institutions are responding to these offers of help. And at its worst, it's just pork barrel politics. The fact that MPs are now supposed to be the crucial supporter in some of these projects, to me just smells like a kind of pork barrelism that we know is bad for the economy, not good for the economy. So at that UK level, we do need reform. We do need to consider how our institutions work together across UK government and also in how they function in working with regional and local governments to make sure we have much better, well-functioning institutions where we can have data sharing about the economy and understand what we're trying to achieve and why. And I think that would be a much better reform than the current obsession with projects and competitions that we have. I think altogether, the idea of real full employment could tackle, at long last, the productivity problems that the UK economy has faced. However, much more importantly, I think it can fulfill a vision that wherever you are in our country, that wherever you happen to be born or grow up, that you should have the chance and opportunity and belief in yourself that truly represents an ambitious plan for our country. As I said, Keir Starmer has set out his vision of prosperity, security, and respect. Real levelling up will involve real full employment so that those values are spread widely and to each and every person in our country. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Alison. So much in there, far too much for us to cover in a conversation, and then we'll get our panelists to come in and give their own reflections. I wanted to start with but also the dominance of these two ideas, these two principles, which is nostalgia, looking to the past, and this worry about technology. We see it all around us. We know it makes our lives better, but we're also deeply fearful of it because we feel like ultimately robots will come and take our jobs. I mean, why is it, do you think, that they are so prominent? And I suppose, think about how do we change the narrative so that both of those become less prevalent and the positive sides of those become to the fore? I mean, why is it? Why do we persistently look backwards and worry?
Because fear and loss is an incredibly strong emotional force in politics. It's always more motivating for people. I mean, I remember when I was a councillor in London Borough of Southwark, right here where we are, for 4 years, I remember some of the conversations we used to have about regeneration and housing. And of course, if you're saying to somebody, look, we know this estate is not good, we know it leaks, we know it causes our children's asthma to be exacerbated, and it's really problematic, and we need to knock it down, and we need to improve the quality of housing. And don't worry, it will all be fine because you'll have somewhere nice afterwards. Of course, people are going to naturally worry about loss much more strongly than they're going to feel positively about what they stand to gain. And I think that's something for politicians always to manage. But what I worry about is that nostalgia, that kind of false prospectus, has become such a pervasive force in politics that it's really holding us back. And I do have some sympathy. I'm not dismissing people.
No.
On my worst days, I can convince myself that the 1990s was the best possible time to be, and it was great fun and the music was better. And but actually, all I mean is it was nice when I was 18.
Yeah.
That's it. It was nice when I was a late teenager, and I think that's a really natural thing. All I would say is don't make that your economic policy.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And just to tie that in, just to get your thought, as you know, I mean, part of the challenge in some respects is when you look across the country at different towns and different cities, particularly some of those that are having a tougher time of it. In a sense, part of the reason they're having a tougher time of it is because they feel like, and rightly, they were more successful in the past. These are they were industrial towns that grew prosperous and prominent in different phases of the economy. So how do we help those places sort of detach themselves to a degree from what made them successful in the past, and what makes them successful in the future is not going to be the same sort of things, right? As you said, it's technology, it's probably much more service orientated than manufacturing orientated, for example.
Yeah, so two things there. So that's why I say every place needs a plan.
Yeah.
I know this in Birkenhead. I'm Wirral South, my constituency, is a suburban area just around Birkenhead, and I know how that feels. I live very close to massive shipyard. I know how many people that used to employ, but I also know what those jobs were like, really hard. And actually, we want a prosperous marine engineering sector because we need the shipyards and those skilled, talented people to be able to not just build and repair ships, but also be able to create some of the assets that we need for renewables, offshore wind. Those same marine engineering skills will be put to use. So I know how that feels to live in a place where people can remember big sites of employment that used to employ lots of people. But I think, as I was saying in my contribution, I think sometimes we do have rose-tinted glasses about how tough those jobs were. And there's countless examples. My own father he was a railwayman all his working life. When he started, he used to go out, really hard job, digging the track, digging the ballast, but quite back-breaking work, dangerous as well on the railway. Now, much of that heavy physical labour is done by robots, machines that run along the track. Yeah. And, I'm afraid I don't regret the loss of that work because it means people are safe and they're free to use their autonomy and their creativity in a way that I think is much more, it's much more life-affirming in the end. So I think every place needs a plan, and part of that plan has to be about looking at the way the economy is and it's going to be. And just on your manufacturing services point, so just because manufacturing has changed and employs people in a different way, it doesn't mean that manufacturing is not a part of our future. And sometimes because of that classification, because we're like, 80% services, 20% manufacturing, we miss the point that some of the things that people do in services are also a part of manufacturing. I was at an electrical engineering firm only recently where they were showing me, how they've revolutionized the design of their electrical products by creating online libraries of the different designs in a way that they can use AI to generate design much more quickly. Yeah. Totally inspiring. We normally think of that kind of design as services, but there it is, functioning as part of a manufacturing operation.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be a little bit careful about that. It's for each place to decide what it wants to do, what it wants to be, and how to make it happen. You get that plan in place, I think people can buy into the future, not the past. And
you talked about, I'm not expecting you to go into the weeds of the detail. You talked a little bit about, now thinking about the how and what to do. And I wonder what your thinking is. Some of the thinking you rightly were outlining in your talk were what we would kind of class as supply side type interventions, helping people come into the labour market, those that are either currently not in it or underemployed in the labour market. Obviously, there's a flip side to that, which is your good jobs point, is that we have to work with businesses and those that are providing the jobs or creating the jobs to make those jobs better. There's a demand side sort of issue. Just where's the balance in thinking in terms of where would you like to see that go? Because you can do more skilling and you can do more, more provision, allow more people to come into the labour market, evolve the welfare system. I think we probably also need to think about the nature of the jobs that are currently available and indeed in the future, and how we improve them through investment and support.
Well, on the first point, Rachel Reeves has talked about modern supply side economics for this very reason, childcare, transport, structures. I think we all get that that's important. On the other side, we've got a plan for that, because I think since the explosion of 0 hours contracts after the crash, everyone in the labour movement has been thinking about how we improve good jobs. And at last Labour Party conference, Angela Rayner set out our reform programme, how we work with trade unions and others to improve the quality of work. And the best businesses want to go down that direction, go down that road. If you look at the way flexible working has developed alongside this vacancies crisis, when I say go to businesses and say we need real full employment, and that means an inclusive labour market and lots of jobs, they're nodding along. I mean, this is the tragedy of the situation, right? Is that good businesses are doing this already without the help and support of the government.
Yeah, there's just not enough. In a sense, we need to do more of it, don't we? Yeah. Okay. We've got some questions coming in. Keep your questions coming in for us, and I'm going to come to the panel in 2 minutes. So just introduce them. Last question, I think, from me for now, Alison. You alluded to and talked a little bit about levelling up being the right policy. We're uncertain as to whether the current government is going to, or the new Prime Minister is going to take that on. Just say a little bit about, where Labour's thinking is in terms of the levelling up agenda and, your preparedness and your willingness to take that on and really begin to own it. Because a lot of the polling, as we know, we did some work with Ipsos Mori, and they were talking to us about it. Levelling up is often regarded as a Labour issue, maybe more so than a Conservative issue.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Also, at the moment, if I was to get a bus from my house in New Ferry to Liverpool City Centre, it costs about £3.80. Steve Rotherham's going to put a cap on bus fares in Merseyside of £2. That will massively help people have better options for work in our area. So when we talk about levelling up, we've got mayors doing it. Their only problem is they haven't got enough powers. And they haven't got a structural way in which they've got a predictable UK government that will set out a plan so that they know how to make their own plan for their place, so that we can all work together. That we've had a government that has, had such political turbulence that actually that's just made life so much more difficult for everyone else, be it in local government or in our combined authorities or in Wales or in Scotland. So my response to that, what's Labour going to do is look at what we are doing. The lack of powers is the major problem, and as I say, Keir's working with Gordon Brown on how we
can really
improve more of that.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, we'll come back and obviously get your reflections as we go on, Alison. But let's just turn to our panelists and get some reflections on what you've said and their reflections more generally, and then we'll open up again for a conversation. So let me just introduce the panelists in the order. It'd be good to get their thoughts on. Our first panelist is Alice Barnard, Alice, and she's the Chief Executive of the Edge Foundation. Our second panelist is Karim Palant, who's a Senior Manager, Public Policy and Economic at LinkedIn. And our third panelist is my colleague Paul Swinney, who's the Director of Policy and Research at the Centre for Cities. So, Alice, over to you. You've heard from Alison. Just say a few words about your reflections of what Alison has been saying, and then we'll take it in turn. So over to you.
Many thanks for inviting the Edge Foundation to participate today, and really interesting listening to Alison talking this morning. A couple of reflections. I totally agree about the point about nostalgia, that we have to be careful we don't look back at the past through rose-coloured spectacles. But I would add that learning from the past is incredibly important, particularly from a policy perspective. Certainly the Edge Foundation has spent a lot of time trying to bring together the important policy changes over the last 20 or so years around education, looking at what has worked, what hasn't worked, and perhaps why it hasn't worked, and whether that's the context of the time, whether it was lack of planning, whether it wasn't pragmatic, but trying to bring that together to allow our policymakers an opportunity to really learn and understand how good policy can be made. Because quite often, good policy can crash and burn if there's a change of government, or if there's a change in funding, or simply it doesn't work in the context of that moment. It doesn't mean that it wasn't a good idea. So increasingly, I think we should be looking back at the past, but quite rightly, as Alison said, not through rose-coloured spectacles, but in a way that allows us to develop policy in a really sensible way that gets the outcomes we're looking for. And you won't be surprised to hear me talking about this from an education perspective, because the Edge Foundation, that is our bread and butter. We're interested in seeing education real and relevant, dynamic environments for young people to learn, an environment that teachers can teach, and most importantly, gives young people the opportunity to get in full employment as a result. My second reflection from Alison's speech was around technology. And again, I agree that technology can provide all sorts of opportunities for the future and can be really exciting. But also we have to remember that technology will also remove a core number of jobs, not necessarily at the bottom of the market actually, but around the middle managers. And it's really important that we enable our young people to be prepared for a career that is likely to jump from full employment, part-time employment, the gig economy. It's not as it was 30 or 50 years ago. Young people are going to have to adapt and be able to work in different environments and probably different sectors. So it's alarming to see that the curriculum now is so tight, it's so knowledge-led, there's very little choice and very little scope for young people to be able to develop their kind of resilience, their team building, the opportunity to work with others, to be problem solvers, all the things that we annoyingly call soft skills, which are actually essential skills. So if we're going to tackle technology in a positive way and see AI and the development of this as a good thing, then we need to give young people the skills to be able to adapt and be able to compete against the robot, to be essential parts of the economy going forward. And to do that, we need to make sure that we don't stifle creativity, which is currently happening. So those are my kind of two key reflections. Should I pass back to you if you want to ask me?
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Alison. We'll come back and get Alison, we'll add into your list of things to think about. So I verbally agree with you in terms of the critical importance, not just of education in general, but actually the way that education gets communicated and engaged with. I think that's really, really quite important. So we'll come back there and get Alison to kind of reflect on that. By the way, we've had a response from an anonymous MD saying the music was better in the 90s. So
it wasn't.
Well, I'm just, we can take that as I think it's probably better than the 90s, well, but I'm just old. Anyway, Karen, let's hear from you around some of the issues that Alison's been raising. Welcome. Good morning. Share us your thoughts.
Thank you very much, and apologies. I'm outside trying to get mobile signal because my home Wi-Fi is completely out of action. So if it's a little breezy where I am, that's why. I can confirm that specifically in 1996 the music was at its peak. I'm here obviously representing LinkedIn. LinkedIn is, many of you will be aware, a professional social networking site. We have about 800 million members and about 30 million LinkedIn members in the UK. That means that we have a unique insight into the trends that are going on in the market, because people use LinkedIn to work, build a professional network, to hire, to engage in job seeking activity and so on. So there's a few trends that I think are really relevant to what Alison was talking about that I just want to pick out that relate to some of the work that we've done over the last few 6 to 12 months. So first of all, it would be remiss, I think, given we all spent the last 48 hours melting, to not mention the climate crisis and the rise of green jobs. We produced a report just a couple of months ago on that very issue, which showed that the UK is actually in a really great place on green skills and green jobs. Actually, in terms of green skills intensity of the labour market, we're actually second only to the United States. And the rate of green hiring in the UK is accelerating much faster than the rate. So we've doubled over the last few years, last 3 years, which is compared to sort of 1.2%, 1.3% growth. So that's obviously a really positive picture. But what we're seeing, and this is a really important, I think, message for the education team and for the pensions team and others, is that we're seeing the rate of green hiring and the rate of green jobs is outpacing the generation of green. So that, I think, in terms of the future rate of full employment and where we might see some real opportunities, green skills is going to be a huge one. By which I mean, let's not all train everybody to be wind technicians, although that's important. It's the green skills that are part of perhaps 50% of the new hires that happen in the economy now, and in fact, green hires outpace the rest of the economy. Because the majority of new jobs hired now have some element of green skills, and that's a really important point. There's obviously a geographical element to that, and that's something that we're digging deeply in. You mentioned a lot disability and gender. And if we are talking about a full employment agenda, those are absolutely key. Apologies for the use of the word agenda. We did a piece of work with the Centre at CBR around disability, and we found that remote working could potentially open up the workplace for around 600,000 disabled employees, potential employees, which have a huge GDP. If we can find a way to do that. And remote working has a huge gender component. We find that women are 24% more likely to apply for a remote working job than men. And we did a survey that found that over half of women have considered moving roles or have moved roles because of a lack of flexible working. And that's actually a hugely important part of this. So that's another really, really important trend we're seeing. And we've seen, remote working is still in terms of job postings, it's still a minority pursuit. We've seen it go from sort of 1 or 2% pre-pandemic in terms of jobs advertised with that to around 14% now. So that's a big jump, and it hasn't gone backwards since the end of the pandemic. So I think that's a few really macro trends that we're seeing that play really into reality.
Fantastic. So I appreciate you kind of finding a place to come into it, Karim. It can't always get everything. So I think we got the gist of particularly. I think the fact that some of those job opportunities are running ahead of the skills in order to fill them, which then ultimately retards the ability for those jobs to become real, and then the flex, which actually is a point Alice made about flexibility. Karim was talking about the kind of the remote aspect, actually being able as a mechanism for more inclusivity and getting us towards full employment and more degree. So we'll come back to both of those sorts of issues, get your thoughts on that as well. Alison, Paul, over to you. Some reflections on what Alison's been saying, what you've been hearing.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And I'll be very brief in the interest of time. So 3 things I thought were very interesting. I picked up what Alice said. The nostalgia point, I think, is an interesting one. If I sort of frame these 3 points in terms of devolution, then look at that nostalgia point in particular, it feels as if Labour's response so far has been about how to return places back to where they were, and certain places were great once upon a time, and that's what we need to get back to. I don't think that actually is particularly helpful for exactly the reasons that Alison set out. It's about looking forward and trying to boost the UK economy through the areas that we do specialise in, particularly through either advanced manufacturing or advanced knowledge-based services. And so hearing that that framework, I think, is a very positive thing if we do want to see divides across the country, be that north v south or southwest v southeast, or however it is that we cut this. It's been a bit of an issue with Labour's position in the past about towns v cities. And I know that Rachel Reeves and Bridget Phillipson have said this before, and to hear Alison say it again today, that pitching towns v cities is just not very helpful. You know, it's understanding the roles that those different parts of the economy play in the national economy, and then what does policy then mean? So when it comes to making those plans, how do you tailor plans in different parts of the country? Successful town v struggling town, successful city v weak city. You know, that's the really important bit we need to grasp if, again, we are going to close the divides that we see across the country. So great to hear that. And then thirdly, devolution has been a theme running through what Alison said. You know, certainly an empowerment of mayors is a thing that we would endorse and think is something that should happen. And we very much look forward to seeing what Gordon Brown's review says to understand in more detail what Labour's position will be on that, and then more generally to understand how Labour's thinking around levelling up is developing as a result of that as well.
Brilliant, great, thank you very much indeed, Paul. So we've got a little bit of time just for a conversation or discussion. Alison, do you want to come back on some of the initial reflections from Alison, from Karen, and from Paul, and then we'll just open it up and we'll continue the conversation.
Yes, definitely. And the first thing I must say is there are important political topics for debate in our country. Whether or not the music was better in the 1990s is one that I am prepared to debate for hours on end.
Are you? Oh, well,
so
I'm not. So
today.
I'm not. So you can win on that one.
But I would say that I've been asked to DJ the Fabian's party at Labour Party conference, and I will be playing nothing from the 90s.
What? So I'm not coming. I was going to come, but now I'm not bothering.
If you want to have that round, that is the place to do it. Anyway, Alice. So. I think we could have this whole session again on skills and on the how section of how we get to real full employment, how we make sure that everybody is able to mobilise their talents depends, you know, as you said, on their ability not just to have technical skills, but also those essential skills of navigating their own career and their own opportunities, relating to other people in the workplace, and understanding how to shift, Alice, as you've said, from sector to sector, not least because we sort of talk about sectors as if they're fixed, because that's how we do the national accounts. You know, that's how the Department for Business works on sectoral divisions. But it's not really true. I was previously Shadow Minister for Culture, and I'm very interested in creativity. To your point, Alice, the national curriculum is just in a state when it comes to creativity. We've basically written music and art out, and then the way that we teach subjects, I think, is so narrow now. So actually, I thought when I was Shadow Minister for Culture, people should be thinking about creativity, not because they're going to go into the creative industries, but because every industry is creative, because everybody is interested in how you use digital technology to develop new ways of doing things. That's what an API is, which is a new way of doing things. So I think that if we could, I'm sure, and I know my colleagues in Bridget's team are thinking about how we help schools garnish that creativity, not just in school hours, but also after school. How do we give kids a sense of ambition and that the world is an open place to them by giving them more opportunities, not just in school, but also out of school. And then also just a final point on this, like this is my real frustration, I think, with the productivity conversation, is that we often say the word productivity and people get to robots so quickly that they just don't really think about what productivity is, which is how effectively you use your time in the labour market. And one of the big productivity problems we have is the quality of management, which again, Alice, is back to your point. It's like, how well are managers able to relate to their staff and help them to achieve what is possible for them? And those management skills, again, we sometimes think of it as a soft skill. Those management skills are something that Britain has not done well at for too long. So I'm really interested in how we can improve coaching as a skill that people have in the labour market. And, you know, I think I also used to be Shadow Minister for Culture and Sport. And I think one of the things that I learned is that good coaches can be incredible for productivity. I mean, look at Jurgen Klopp, sorry Karim, but you know, he gets a lot out of his players because he's a great coach. And that's what we need of every manager. Okay, anyway.
There are other great coaches in the football world.
Other great coaches are available.
Before I get inundated with questions and comments, you know, your music one was already one, so don't go down that road. We're going to get loads of questions.
I'm just swinging at everything. Anyway, Paul, I'll come back to Karim's point in a second. But Paul, on devolution, yeah, you know, look, I'll be open about this. When in Merseyside, we had the opportunity to take some more power so we could run things ourselves in Merseyside. You know, I enthusiastically ran up to committee corridor to get that bit of legislation through and create the Merseyside Combined Authority. I don't think I've done anything else, you know, more enthusiastically in my 12 years in opposition. And we want to progress it further. You know, I spend a lot of time with colleagues in Merseyside thinking about the development of that combined authority, and I've seen the power of it, so we want to go further. And finally, on Karim's point, yeah, I mean, there's so much opportunity in changing our economy to tackle climate change and to do what we need to do on energy. It's a growth opportunity. Yeah. The Tories are absolutely wrong on this, I'm afraid. The idea that tackling climate change is an opposing objective to a growing economy is absolutely wrong. And just as Karim says, the fact that we are creating jobs that we haven't got skilled people to do is just a massive chance for us. So I'm keen and enthusiastic to work with Alice, yourselves, Karim at LinkedIn and others to see how we can make more of that, because this is about the chances and opportunities for people in our country, and having a good job is at the heart of having a good life.
Yeah.
We just need the right policy, opportunities and institutions that can build that platform for people to stand.
Yeah, no, brilliant, great. Alice, I wanted to come back to you. You talked about, you know, the need to reform the way the education system works and actually the content of it. If, you know, are you advocating for kind of what's the structural reform question that needs to be dealt with? I mean, I'm sure there can be lots of tinkering in the way that things get done, you know, at the individual level, at the school level, at the class level, but the structural reform that you would want to see in order to inject more creativity, more of these kind of newer, softer skills, as you would call them, although they're not very soft. What would be the structural reform that you would want to see happen?
I'm delighted you asked me that. I think for us, the key to a really radical change for education is rethinking assessment. Schools respond to what they're measured on. And if they're measured on GCSE results, A-level results, and the number of children going to university, that is what they're going to perform against. They're going to perform against the EBAC and Progress 8. And that has seen, going back to Alison's point, a reduction of 41% in those taking up performing arts, a reduction of almost 10% in those taking music. You know, as Alison says, creativity isn't about necessarily going into performing arts or into film and other creative industries. It is about being able to flex and think on your feet, and that you need in every single role. So for us, rethinking assessment is absolutely critical. It's about trying to assess young people on more than just their ability to learn and regurgitate facts. We're not saying that you can't have exams as part of that, but we think having linear exams with a cliff edge moment in the summer, in this heat, is not the best way to understand what a child's ability really is and what they are best suited for the rest of their lives, to have a good life, to be part of their community, to contribute, to have a full and successful life. So rethinking assessment, I think, is critical to that. It's the least sexy part of the whole thing, but if you change assessment, then everything else will change with it. Pedagogy, you know, the ability for teachers to be able to flex and think on their feet and be able to teach enthusiastically and dynamically instead of just chalk and talk. And let's be honest, you know, a curriculum that mirrors that of 1904 in 2022 is a complete fallacy.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed, Alice. Karen, I think you're still with us. You may have your video off. Maybe I wanted to just to get your thought on, you know, you identified the mismatch between green jobs and green skills, and I wonder, you know, in a sense, what gives us the best chance of dealing with a mismatch? And Alison's point about certainty from the government, for example, that the green agenda is not something that's going to be, it's going to wax and wane depending on any given situation. But beyond government confidence, what's your thought on the most effective way we might be able to deal with this mismatch?
So I think the role for government, and you mentioned that in terms of certainty, leadership, creating the framework. There is a role for business in thinking about what it is about your workforce that gives you the best opportunity to train them to shift into greener skills and greener jobs. We don't think that moving from one job to another requires an entirely new set of qualifications and an entirely new set of skills. Often it's an additional 2 or 3 skills that might shift your focus as an individual from job A to job B. And actually that's what the green transition we think is going to look like. And that's a major role for business in thinking about their workforce in that way. And both in terms of their existing workforce and in terms of hiring. One of the things we talk a lot about at LinkedIn is skills-based hiring rather than paper-based hiring or qualifications-based hiring. And that's something that we model for the green transition. And then there's a role for individuals. Obviously, we know about personal responsibility in terms of climate, but there's a role and responsibility for individuals to be thinking about how they themselves can be adapting their skills and adapting their professional path towards a greener path. And actually, we're seeing this with younger generations of potential employees, that employers are having to compete on values and compete on mission in order to attract people, especially in what is currently quite a tight labour market. And that's something that individuals taking responsibility and saying, I want to work for an organisation that's forward thinking on climate, and I want to work for an organisation that's going to develop my climate and green related skills. So I think there's a whole suite of measures that need to be taken across the whole economy: a role for government, a role for business, and a role for individuals.
Brilliant, excellent. Alison, come back in. We pick up on what Alice said and what Karen said, but also just that sort of question or the issue that Paul was touching on and you were touching on. And this may be a slightly unfair question, but opposition parties are often in favour of more devolution until they get into power. That's slightly, essentially. But you advocated more powers for mayors, the existing mayors, and also more power in general being devolved down. How do we ensure what needs to happen for us to be confident and for you to be confident that it happens if and when you get into power? Because it's always a nice thing to say, then you're in power. Like, oh dear, where are my levers? My levers are with Steve in Merseyside.
It's like oh, there definitely must be a devolution until I'm
the minister, then I know best, right? Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure you wouldn't be like that.
No, absolutely right. But okay, so there's a couple of things there. I mean, firstly, Alice was right before. My fear of nostalgia ought never to extend to being ignorant of the past. That would be a mistake. And the past can teach us some things. And I think often of the halcyon days when local authorities used to get 3-year settlements from the Treasury on their own funding. And it sounds like a detailed point, but having lived through a decade where local authorities have tried to plan year on year when they might not know actually what the government resource picture is going to look like, what the UK government is going to provide in terms of resource for their work until a couple of months before they're legally required to set their budget. That is a kind of institutional dysfunction that makes policy making very hard. So I do think that Labour had a decent record of this in government. I don't think it was a perfect record. But I think we can learn from the way that we related to local authorities in certain aspects to build a better settlement and institutional arrangement as we move forward. Similarly, the work of regional development agencies has been swiftly forgotten, but must be learned from. particularly in relation to hard infrastructure. I used to work for Network Rail. We got to a point towards the end of the Labour government where we had a decent planning system for railway investment. You know, much unpicked by their political debate since, but I think we should be learning about that. How did we get those processes right? How did we get that institutional framework right? What was less good? And if we're building a new institutional framework, what can we use again? Because actually it was working okay, and what do we need to learn from? So I would say look at Labour's record. It actually wasn't that bad.
Okay, very good. Paul, come back in on your, sorry.
Just second very important point, audit. If you're going to do more devolution, we lost the audit commission with George Osborne. We need to be able to follow them.
We're slowly reintroducing that system, right?
Exactly.
I mean, by crook and by, but it's also Alice's point about, we can have policies at the front end which say we're going to do A, B, and C, but if we have a measurement or an audit system that actually measures X, Y, and Z, then ultimately X, Y, and Z dominate out, even if the policy remains largely the same at the front end. So I think thinking about those sorts of issues are really quite important. It's a great point on that. Paul, just come back in on your you made several points, but just pick up this cities and towns one, because we get this a lot. How does one help politicians not get into that? What would we say to politicians of different stripes and persuasions about actually that's a false dichotomy and it's not the way to go? Just give us a thought on that.
So it's understanding the roles that these different places play, both in the national economy, but also the relationships they've got between them. And I think the example around Birmingham is the most interesting one that we've come across, in that if you look at the towns around Birmingham, of between 30,000 and 135,000, there are 9 sitting outside of that West Midlands conurbation. Of those 9, 2 of them do very well and 7 of them struggle. Now, if you look at the 2 that do well, what you find, which I think is Bromsgrove and Lichfield, if I remember rightly, if you look at the reasons why they in part do well from an employment perspective, is that there are a lot of people commuting into Birmingham, into high-paid jobs in Birmingham in particular, because Birmingham is a source of lots of high-paid jobs. Of course, the problem for the other 7 is that while Birmingham is a source of high-paid jobs, Birmingham massively underperforms. Now, that's bad for the West Midlands wider region, but it's bad for the national economy too. It's costing the national economy billions of pounds a year, which then means that actually, in terms of generating that wider prosperity, it's only generating enough prosperity for 2 of those 9 towns, when really should generate enough prosperity for at least 7, 8, if not 9 of them. And it really shows the importance of getting Birmingham right, which has to sort of take quite a big role in policy perspective. So there were some very large market failures there. But if we just go down the route of saying, we're just going to do something for these 7 towns without actually dealing with that Birmingham issue as well, then you're not really helping the people in those towns in a sustainable long-term nature. So that relationship is very important too. Now, of course, that is not an argument to ignore those places, and there's investments that should be made in them, but it is understanding what that relationship looks like and where is the best place to make the intervention, both for the benefit of the person or people who may live in those towns that are struggling, but also for the national economy too.
Great, excellent. So we've got 6 minutes left. We're definitely finishing at 11:14 because Alison needs to be, as I said, to go and watch PMQs. Alice, let me start with you. Just come back to Alison's kind of argument, in a sense that we should aspire to and have an aspiration and a goal around full employment, not just in and of its own sake, but because it drives a bunch of other benefits in terms of inclusivity and quality and such. I mean, from your own perspective, if we were to make that a goal or ambition, how do you see what would need to happen from your perspective for that to be made real in the next period?
Well, I'd start by saying I actually think it's completely achievable, but I think it has to start so much earlier. So we're talking about, the failure of the education system to be able to produce young people that are work ready. So we need to go right back to the beginning, and we need to think about education right the way through to 24 and how that works. And I think that is partly about changing our fixation on education simply being about exams and more about developing the whole person. I think that the Open University published their Business Barometer report, which said that currently the skills gap is costing the UK economy £6.1 billion. If we don't get this right, that eye-watering figure is only going to grow. The Edge Foundation produces a number of up-to-date skills shortage analysis pamphlets every year, which tries to fill the gap that was left by UK SERS, trying to look at where the challenges are, but also the opportunities. But unless we go right back to the beginning and think about teaching and learning, how and why we engage young people, the number of young people who are not engaged in their learning is quite catastrophic. The number of kids that end up in pupil referral units, the number of kids that don't see the point of education. You know, the third world understands that education is the route out of poverty. We have an education system here that is free and available to all, but it is not allowing young people to thrive unless we re-engage them, unless we make them understand that this is their way, not just out of poverty, but into society, into a commitment to those around them. Then, you know, we aren't going to achieve, but it is fully achievable, but it is all down to making learning contextualized. And I think we're kind of forgetting the employers in this. You know, everybody actually agrees that education is not fit for purpose. Young people, teachers, employers. The only one that is out of step on this is the government. And that's not a party political point. It's just a fact.
Okay, excellent, good. Karen, give me 60 seconds on this, otherwise I'm going to fail at my task to finish at 11:40.
So, I mean, one thing I would say is there are clearly opportunities to close some of those skill gaps at a regional level that have not yet been fully materialised. The government has its local skill partnerships, which are controversial in some quarters, but they are at least looking at ways in which business employers in particular regions have identified gaps in the skills that they need in their regions. We're hoping to provide some of our data to help some of that decision making. We think it's a really important contribution we can make. And I think the more we're able to capture the skills that people have that have not necessarily come from qualifications, which is a snapshot in time, and the more that we capture the skills that people have built over a career, and think therefore about how they might be able to move into the jobs of the future in particular regions, then I think that's a real opportunity.
Brilliant, excellent, grand, fantastic. Paul, you've got 30 seconds. If we had a fourth speaker, they'd have 10 seconds. So luckily we don't. Only Alison, and she can talk for as long as she wants. But Paul.
So skills is the biggest predictor of how we see, or the variation we see in the economy across the country, and try to tackle that is central. I think points made about reforming curriculums are very interesting ones. I think one I would throw in too is that we spend a lot of money on skills at the local level already. Those places that have mayors in place, I think, have got the ability to do a skills audit to actually understand where we spend the money, because we don't do that. We don't actually understand that already. There's a big opportunity there and a bit of a war chest that the mayors can start influencing indirectly if they're able to map some of that out and just better use what we've got currently, as well as seeing reforms or perhaps more money in the system too.
Fantastic, Paul. Alison, final thoughts from you.
I think we could have the next session of this Brains Trust on skills.
Okay.
Because, as Paul rightly said, it's the biggest barrier and the biggest determinant. The skill level of the people in your place should be the centre point of the place for your plan. But I just leave with this final thought, which is I'm hopefully going to shortly watch Boris Johnson do his last Prime Minister's questions. I have raged with fury in every Prime Minister's questions, pretty much, as in his defence, every time he's criticised, he says, but I've created an economy where there's more people in work, where we've got a huge number of vacancies and people moving into work, and it makes me burn with anger because I, in my own constituency and everywhere else I visit in the country, see people prevented taking up opportunities rather than having a chance at a good quality of life and the ability to work so that they can look after their family and be and do all the things that they might wish. And putting that right, I think, is a driving mission for us all.
Excellent, very good. 11:14, we need to finish. Huge thanks to you, Alison, for coming and sharing your thoughts and engaging in the panel in such a fantastic way. Huge thanks to my panelists. Alice, thank you very much. Paul, thank you very much. Karen, thank you very much indeed. Thanks to everybody for joining and posting questions. You can get all our work on Levelling Up. We still call it Levelling Up, even if the government currently doesn't, on our website. centrevisities.org. We'll come back to you on maybe a further round of conversations in relation to skills. But until the next time, take care and stay safe. Bye for now.